So while a few people are still starting to come into the room, why don't we get started here, because we've got a lot of stuff to cover in a relatively short period of time. Now, the thing I love about the Charleston conference is just how many people are here and how you can't walk through the lobby of the Francis Marion Hotel here without bumping into about a dozen people making you late for your next session and trying to find where to go and who to talk to, and you always wind up running out of time. Now, JJ doesn't know this, but I just had coffee right before lunch with somebody from another company that we've done a lot of work with, and he said, oh my gosh, you're going to be presenting with JJ, he's a good friend. Now it turns out that Jeff Walensky from ProQuest, Jeff's wife actually works with JJ at the University of Michigan Law School, completely unrelated connection. Again, just another example of how these different connections occur. So what we're going to talk about today is a lot about these connections. It's a lot about ways in which we start to connect research, we start to connect people in different ways than we've traditionally been able to do that. So what I always like to do, what I like to start off with, is kind of a quick overview of SSRN. And so here's some information, and I'm certain everybody can read it fine. But the fourth bullet's really the one that I want to kind of try to highlight. And the fourth bullet says levels a playing field amongst researchers. So what we like to think about from an SSRN perspective is that the fact that it just doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter if you're at Harvard. It doesn't matter if you're at Michigan. It doesn't matter if you're from Monroe Community College in Rochester, New York, where I live. It just doesn't matter. If you write research, give the research a chance to breathe. Give it a chance to be out there. Give it a chance to be in the conversation so that others can build cool, new, innovative research on top of that. So our traditional tagline, our traditional approach has been tomorrow's research today. So when we started to look at research, what we would do is we would have this early stage research. We would get content into SSRN well in advance of publication. So just a basic data point. When we looked at the Journal of Finance, Journal of Financial Economics, we had every single paper that the Journal of Financial Economics published in 2015. We had it in the SSRN library, every paper but one, in the SSRN library 3.5 years in advance. So researchers were able to build on this research. They were able to access this research 3.5 years in advance of publication. So that's what we meant by early stage research. That's what we meant by tomorrow's research today. Now, back then, we actually had this kind of little bit dated website. So over time, we've kind of evolved the website to go from frames and some colors that to this day I still don't know who picked them out, to kind of some cheesy little graphics and shadowing, because that was kind of a new way to throw some stuff onto a page, to a website that we thought was kind of new and different and innovative. So being the small company that we were, we decided to keep this website for a while without realizing that maybe a little bit more modern website would be helpful. So we've kind of updated the website. But this is just the visual nature of SSRN. This is just kind of the look and feel of the basic homepage. But at its core, the sharing of the research amongst the different disciplines, the sharing of the research amongst the different networks has always been a mantra within SSRN. So now what you see here is the new networks, biology and chemistry. We just actually announced women's and gender studies. Shirley Decker-Lucky's in the room. She's our publishing director. She's been working very hard to keep up with my ridiculous demands to come out with new networks, far greater pace than ever before. So we created 20 networks in the past 20 years. And with Shirley's help, we've been able to create 3, soon to be 4 networks this year. So it's a much more rapid pace. And we'll talk about the importance of this expansion of networks. Again, it's not just to add more networks, but what we want to try to do is create the connections between the networks so that we can help researchers create cool, new, innovative research faster. So when we step back and we looked at tomorrow's research today, it was actually wound up being much, much more. So what we're really trying to accomplish is connecting the researchers in ways that have not been possible before. Not just a social network, not just to be able to email people, but really help them connect from a research to research perspective. We want to help them develop their ideas. We want to get as early in the pipeline, as early in the research dialogue as possible so those ideas can be shared. Maybe some ideas are silly ideas and shouldn't be moved forward. We shouldn't waste time. We shouldn't waste money on it. But other ideas maybe need to be nurtured by connecting researchers so that you can point out, hey, look over here, Greg. This is some research that will help move your research forward faster. And then obviously the core of everything that we do is to share the early research freely, openly, as broadly as possible. So we want to make SSRN this platform for the new news, we like to say. Everything prior to publication, let's make it freely available. Let's allow people to create new, cool, innovative research faster. So when I talk about this, I often talk about innovation. Now, invention, as we all know, is creating something new from something that doesn't exist, right? It's new. It's invention. What we're talking about here is innovation. So what you see on the screen is my very simple definition of innovation: to create new things by being exposed to a broader, deeper set of existing things. And what we're simply trying to do at SSRN is to make it the broadest, deepest set of existing things that we can. So we help them create innovative research faster. What you see here is a bit of a messy, kind of complex chart. It's an internal chart, and I wanted to show you just all of the different things that we've been doing over the last 20 years. So you see back in 1995, we started with accounting and economics and finance, and then you see the different timeline where we added DOIs, where we were the largest repository in the world, where we started to hit lots and lots of downloads. And you see in the bottom right some of the next networks that we've been queued up. We talked about education and sociology. We talked about women's and gender studies. So women's and gender studies was announced just the other day. So that's one of the new ones, and these other ones are starting to come out. But what we realized was that the interconnection between the different networks, the ability to just share ideas across networks, was limited if we were just in the social sciences or just in the social sciences and humanities. So now we've started to add life and physical sciences. So as I said, we have biology and chemistry and women's and gender studies back to the core roots. And we're going to come out with engineering very soon. So we have these new networks that touch on different types of areas that allow different types of connections. And what we like to say is we want to let those 1,000 flowers bloom. Whatever the network, wherever the researcher's from, it doesn't matter whether you're from the US or from the UK or India or Asia. I just spent the last week and a half in Asia with meeting with professors and universities and governmental agencies in Beijing and Seoul and Tokyo. There's a lot of great research happening in those areas, but it hasn't necessarily all made its way to the US. It hasn't necessarily made its way all online, and that's what we're trying to accomplish, to share that research more broadly. Now, we're all about sharing. We're all about sharing freely and openly, but we want to make sure there's some bar of quality. Now again, we're not talking about peer review, right? We believe peer review is a very, very valuable and very, very important process. But we're not talking about peer review because that has its own set of constraints. What we're talking about is a very simple review process. So within SSRN, we have a 3-stage process. Stage 1 is a review for completeness. We look at every single thing that gets submitted to us. We make sure that it has the right metadata, that the right PDF is attached, that the right authors are listed, that they're affiliated properly. We think that that metadata becomes critically important as we start to do a lot of the other things we do on top of it. So stage 1 is a review for completeness, and is it part of the scholarly discourse? It's very easy for somebody to want to put up pornography or things like that. That's relatively simple to weed out. But what you find is you start to get opinion pieces or marketing pieces or consulting speak, and those are the things we want to pull out so that we're really talking about content, about papers, about information in the scholarly discourse. Stage 2, we'll talk a lot about stage 2 over the next several minutes, but stage 2 is classification. Where do we find the right homes for it? In other words, if we just put all 70,000 submissions and all 50,000 submissions that we get every year, all 800,000 papers into one big bucket, you'd have to rely on search to be able to find things. And search works great, but it doesn't work great when you can add curation on top of it. So we curate the content. We find as many homes for it, as many appropriate homes for it as possible. And then we take this classification component and we use that for dissemination. So stage 3, where we've taken the classifications that we use and use that to disseminate, to share the research out to people, give them alerts to the various different components that we have. Now in stage 2, we cross-pollinate. So if I submit a paper, so JJ submits a paper in law, we take JJ's paper in law and we also classify it into these other areas. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But again, it's JJ as a researcher looking at a problem. How do we share that with other researchers in other disciplines looking at the same problem? So how do we start to look at those problems from different perspectives? And so as I say here, this access accelerates performance, but we need a process to make sure that it works well, works efficiently. Otherwise, it's just information overabundance. More information, not necessarily more value. So as a simple example, this is law. This is just one of the 30 networks that we have within SSRN. Here's all the areas that a researcher like JJ can classify into just within law. So the complexity becomes overwhelming. Yet, if you're interested in family and children's law, we have an e-journal. We have a community for you. So you can just look at those papers. And in that one area, there's almost 9,000 papers within the SSRN library. So even these, what you consider to be small micro-communities, have a lot of content that people are exposed to, that they become aware of, that they can build on or use in their daily lives. One of the things that I've just been playing around with recently as Shirley's come on board and we started to think about the ways that we start to help researchers share is bringing in this concept of the strength of weak ties. So those of you familiar with social networks, those of you familiar with this particular vein of research understand what I'm talking about. But basically, what it says is that you have a community that you work within, that you either interact with, or you work within, or you live within. And those are strong ties. Those are people that you know well, that you interact with a lot. But then you also have weak ties, where you may touch on something from a different community. And the concept here is that those weak ties, because they're not in the same way that you think about things, actually can have more influence, more impact on your life. So what we've been starting to think about is the ways in which this cross-pollination of ideas, the sharing of JJ's law research with someone in women's and gender studies or someone in economics can help them see the problem differently. So this cross-pollination of perspectives we think helps out a lot. I wrote a paper, we don't have time about it, we talk a lot about open access here at this conference, so there's a paper, I just pushed up a blog post about open access, and I talk about how confusing open access can be, but I talk about this cross-pollination of perspectives, and that can help us move things forward, and why sharing at an early stage is important. So, I don't want to take up too much of the time, because I want to get over to JJ and talk a bit about JJ. So, JJ is a professor of law at the University of Michigan. He's also a professor of economics. He's the co-director of the program in law and economics and the co-director of the Empirical Legal Studies Center. He's got his undergraduate at Stanford, got his law degree, his JD at Harvard Law School, and has a PhD in economics from MIT. So I'm really happy to have JJ here, not just because he's a smart guy, not just because he uses SSRN, which obviously are very important, but also because he has a really good perspective on the ways in which this research gets shared. And we'll have a few questions with him and then open it up for more Q&A more broadly. But JJ, I was looking at some of your papers in SSRN, and I was actually blown away by it. So your papers, not just in law where you've submitted them into, but your papers have been classified also by the team into management, finance, economics, entrepreneurship, philosophy, political science, sustainability, into a couple of areas of humanities, and they're also appearing on our new network, Women's and Gender Studies. So this is a law professor sharing his research in all of these different areas. I mean, I was wonderfully surprised by it.
Now I know why I'm here.
So JJ, what I wanted to do is I just wanted to give a chance for people to hear the perspective of what we're talking about, this different platforms and things like that, from somebody who actually is living and breathing it. So it wasn't just SSRNs. So how are just to pull a couple of things out of the abstract that you pulled together of your views on it for the conference. So talk a little bit about how you see different platforms bringing together the different disciplines. How do you see it from your perspective at Michigan?
Yeah, so I guess unlike some researchers out there, I come from two disciplines. So I've trained as a lawyer and I've trained as an economist, which right from the beginning made me think very differently about sometimes the same topic. And depending on the audience I was engaging with, I would think about the topics differently. And I guess I've continued to believe that was valuable. So in my research in recent years, I've worked with business school professors, I've worked with public policy scholars, I'm even these days working with people at the School of Information here at Michigan, social work faculty, and so on. And I mean, I think I've come up in an age of SSRN and other online tools, and for me, I mean, having quick access to a ton of information has been the milieu from the beginning. If I really want to find a particular thing, it's usually not too hard, especially when I have a librarian that's able to help me. If I want to instead attack a particular problem, then it's a little more difficult because one of the things I've discovered, especially in my research, my economics and empirical research, is that there are lots of social scientists that do empirical research. They oftentimes use different terms for the same basic tools, and when you look at projects that focus on the same issues, different disciplines just make a much bigger deal about certain types of research questions. So economists, especially empirical economists, are very interested in causal relationships. Statisticians are much more interested in prediction, and even so, a lot of times things that economists are sorting out now have been sorted out by statisticians for a long time, just sometimes under different names. And at least, I mean, I think this is where the future heads. But now, with the access to a place that at least gives some cursory organization that categorizes papers by subject matter as much as by discipline, you have a chance of discovering those connections when you might never have been able to do that in the past. So law schools are increasingly, or at least some of them are increasingly interdisciplinary, and that's really because, even though there's a law library here at the University of Michigan Law School, a fantastic one actually, I almost never go into it. I use its services all the time, but they're mostly online services and ways that allow me to access essentially non-legal resources. And I think, Greg, your point was exactly right, that more information is just more information. And I don't think these days the problem is having access, at least for somebody like me at the University of Michigan. I mean, I can usually get access to anything that's out there one way or another. The problem is really figuring out how to not make it take a ton of time, to the point where I'm not even willing to engage in the hunt. And time is my most valuable resource. And as platforms get better and better able to kind of identify where I'm heading, predict where I'm heading, I think that the people being siloed into disciplines is going to become less and less a reality at universities. I mean, it's kind of interesting you mentioned gender and women's studies, because on Friday I'm having a brainstorming session with the director of a gender program here at the University of Michigan. We know each other. I mean, I haven't seen her in a few years, but she knows about some of the things I've been working on. I know about some of the things she's working on, and she wants to get together to talk about potential ways of collaborating. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we run across each other's stuff in ways that never would have happened if we were just using our department libraries.
JJ, let me pull on that string a little bit. So I talked about the second stage of classification, right, where we take your law paper and we find other homes for it across the 29 other disciplines, the 29 other networks within SSRN. So I know that you have a view in this, but it's this translation problem, right? It's we're trying to translate the way that the economist says, ABC, to the way that the lawyer says ABC, to the way that the finance professor, even if it's finance and economics, they still speak differently, right? Securities versus economic principles versus, let alone corporate governance or sustainability or a lot of these other areas. So give us your views into this kind of the seeing into other disciplines, right? The importance of it, the ability to be much more efficient because we've learned from what others have done, and not just in our strong tie communities, but in these other communities around us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest hurdles in research these days has more to do with the fact that, we're spending a lot of time reinventing wheels across departments. And, I think that there have always been scholars that are capable of leaning outside of their departments and are taking what's really interesting and useful from another discipline. But honestly, I'd say the average academic just doesn't have the time, or maybe not even the ability to make those kinds of connections in a way that's really efficient. So it makes much more sense for me to continue to dive and dig into my own discipline, my own strong tie network, and try to please that network and innovate within that group of people, rather than trying to get out on the edge of thinking about if we think about how far any particular department has gotten in working on a particular problem, that's where I want to be. I want to be out there on the edge. And I think you're absolutely right that the weak ties. I mean, right now I'm not doing any collaborative work with anybody at the University of Michigan Law School, but I have ongoing research with people outside of outside of the law school here, I'm going to try. I don't know exactly how that happened, but certainly part of it has to do with the fact that we've connected. So I've certainly connected with co-authors and collaborators by just running across papers on SSRN that, because of certain keywords or because of where they wind up on my feed, I just happen to see them. And it turns out we have another connection, or I recognize their name from someplace, and that kind of, just that extra push helps me pull on that weak tie, and hopefully, I'd like to think, make real progress on my research.
It's interesting. I had a conversation at lunch, and the conversation at lunch was kind of this evolving role of librarians, right? That they used to be those connections, right? You used to walk in and I'm old enough to remember card catalogs, right? And God forbid you actually had to flip through a card catalog to find something. But the librarian actually helped you find things. And so what we've done is we've tried to move that forward with this curation process within SSRN. And a lot of the librarians that I talk to now, the library schools have been rebranded as iSchools, because we're talking about this information services and this ability to see into the different tools and start to take advantage of that. Are you seeing anything happening from your perspective in like machine learning or other areas, or is it still a little bit early? I mean, I sometimes think.
I think it's a little bit early, but I also think that that where we're going to see this is likely to be at places like SSRN. So if I walk into a library today, the reason why it doesn't work the same way as it used to is that there's just simply so much more. And so when libraries, and maybe I'm naive and there's always been so much more, but then the library is ultimately curated because a lot of stuff that's just older just gets thrown out. So we wind up just reinventing things over and over again. And I don't think that's useful. In the long run, though, we're not going to have to go and kind of poke around in a set of materials that is probably ever growing larger. Instead, we're going to have a personalized set that is kind of distinct, that is determined by what seems relevant to us through the methods or the topics or so on. And unsupervised machine learning, I don't know of anybody that's using it. But supervised machine learning usually involves a human trying to figure out how best to predict what another human, for example, might want to see. But there's no reason to potentially rely on that in the long term. Like, you're going to be able to take papers, see the kinds of works they cite, see the kinds of words that are used in those papers, the kinds of words that are used in other papers in the same topic, and draw connections between them. Machine learning algorithms are going to be able to do this. And eventually they're going to get good. I mean, at least if there's a demand for this sort of thing, they're going to get, it's going to get to the point where instead of just kind of going through titles and trying to see whether the title sounds right or useful to me, or reading an abstract to see whether or not I should continue reading the paper, the papers that are going to be suggested are going to be pretty much on point, and I'm going to feel much more confident that I know what's been done and what's out there. So that instead of, I don't know, maybe I'm a little more compulsive about this than some, but I really, I really hate the idea that I'm writing a paper that somebody's already written, and the amount of time that one can spend just trying to make themselves feel confident that that's not going on seems like a lot of wasted time. Like, it should be the kind of thing that you should be able to check quickly. And I think, machine learning and other future technologies, I think, are going to be able to do this for us.
It's funny, one of the things that Shirley's been working on a lot lately is based on the conversations we've had with funders, where the funders, continue to sponsor different research that's almost the exact same across funders or even within the same funding body. And one of the things that they keep, one of the reasons why they keep doing this is because there's this lack of sharing of negative results. So one of the things that Shirley's been pushing hard recently is just the ability to share negative results. And so, looking from the outside in, you would say, well, why wouldn't you just share negative results? Effectively, it's paid for. But the reality is there was no benefit. There was no reason to share negative results. They were rarely ever published, except for a few specialty journals. But if you're sharing negative results within SSRN, or another early stage platform, you can share this idea, and by sharing the idea, other people can learn from it. It can be cited, it can be downloaded, it can be used in a way, because there's no printing cost associated with it, it can be shared in a way that wasn't possible. So you're exactly right. It's these new ways to start to look inside of things, these new ways to start to try to be more efficient in what we're trying to accomplish, but also just the ability to let the technology be trusted. And I think that was the point you were making, is the trust starts to become more valuable, but it's certainly not going to happen overnight.
I think that's right. And I agree that the publication of negative results, there are lots of institutional incentives against doing that. I mean, it's just much less interesting to show that you didn't find anything, although that is indeed valuable, because it's a terrible idea to have, 3 or 4 people in a row do the same exact thing and find the same exact thing, and yet nobody ever has the, so, and having an opportunity to kind of post something short and quick describing what you've done and the results you got would be great. I think it's going to need to be combined with some institutional rewards for doing that sort of thing, which haven't yet developed in my view. The other thing too is replication. So replication is also incredibly important. There are, again, lots of more subtle institutional social problems that have to be overcome, but where papers, instead of it just being a paper that's in a book or a paper that's online, but actually a package, as we go forward, a package of both the results written up, but also all of the other things that went into the results, especially where we're doing, science or social science, and there's written work and data analysis that goes on behind the scenes. We're going to, I think, get to the point where we're going to be able to much more efficiently review and understand and where the work is bad, discover it and out it. And I think that has huge consequences for making our disciplines more trustworthy. I mean, I think especially in social psychology, lots of interest in the popular press lately about how, just how unreliable a lot of the research has been, in part because if you get something that's really interesting, people care more about whether it's interesting and don't really, the cost of actually checking into it and checking it out, I mean, that takes a lot of time. And oftentimes the only payoff from doing so is potentially getting into an academic dispute with another scholar. And so I actually think that in the very long run, we could imagine writing and doing our research in a way that could be verified by certain kinds of computer programs. They can kind of run certain diagnostics to say, listen, the programs here and the research, you run the programs, they work, they produce the results. Here are certain steps that we consider to be standard practice, certain checklists, and all of that could happen in a way that would make us feel, I think, much more confident in the research and allow us to move forward faster.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned replication. I actually had a long couple of conversations with the colleagues of yours up there at Michigan, Skip Lapia, and Skip's a top researcher in political science, and And what he helped me understand was in social sciences, I'll make a little bit of a dramatic statement, but if we're not careful in social sciences, it will devolve to opinion. So without transparency, without replication, without reproducibility, especially in the social sciences, we need the ability to say, here's the methods, here's what we did, here's the results that we got. Otherwise, it just becomes more opinion, and there's plenty of stuff about fake news and everything else. But even as you just said, in social science, legal, other research, the ability to have replication, to be able to have somebody else look through your research, understand the results that you got, and understand how you got them, and add some level of validation to them becomes critically important. A lot of it's been more money towards natural sciences than social sciences and things like that. Again, it's not a conversation we have time for now, but if we don't think about that, if we don't think about how to start to value the research by looking at the methods, replication and things like that, then we're going to, like we just said, we're going to devolve to opinion, and a lot of great research is just going to go by the wayside.
Well, let me also suggest another way that I think that platforms in the long run could be useful. So right now, of course, there are always people who have proprietary data that they're using and that they can't share for purposes of replication, which is an issue. And I can imagine some point in the future having either computer programs or some way of allowing even proprietary data to be employed for purposes, to be used to replicate certain things where you don't have any particular individual accessing the data. In other words, you're kind of doing it almost like pieces of it so that no single individual has access to anything. But I also think that even earlier in this timeline will be the ability of platforms and technology to identify papers that use data from a certain source, to evaluate whether or not it seems like the paper is using all the data from that source by looking at tables, looking at the number of ends in the regressions or in the tables, and running through a bunch of essentially diagnostics to figure out, okay, is this, let's think about how we could label this as, either needs to be checked more thoroughly, or, the number of observations and the kinds of data being used out of this survey line up with the 32 other papers that have used this survey. All the data seems to be there. The summary statistics seems to line up with other papers, and therefore, at least an initial indicator would suggest that this research is reliable. And again, I think that's the kind of thing that we can ultimately expect, smart tools to do for us. And it won't be possible for us to sort of, just take half the data or to trim it in certain ways without, if somebody reads the paper, they're going to see that you trimmed it in certain ways, or they could look at other papers and draw that inference. But it sure would be nice if we knew that right at the outset, when you put your paper up on SSRN or someplace else, there would be a signal that would say, all right, well, a little bit like running through checks on your e-filing of your taxes. There are certain rules or norms that don't seem to be satisfied by this paper. Perhaps you want to, explain why that's the case in this, in this text box, so that people have a sense of why you're doing what you're doing, and maybe that will also create a cue for those people who are interested in kind of replicating studies and providing the sort of enforcement we might need.
I think it's interesting, we spent a lot of time, I spent a lot of time with a lot of smart people thinking about how publishing is being broken down into aggregation and certification and dissemination and archiving, and how are the value propositions amongst the different components of that. So when I think about certification, if peer review is the gold standard, then I like to think about this kind of like baseline of call it certification light. Maybe it's just like a good housekeeping stamp of approval with these automated systems that you're talking about, that we've run it through this so you have a little bit better comfort, a little bit more trust in this particular object, so that we're not just talking about, yes, here's a paper and it's peer reviewed or not peer reviewed, but how do we start to use some of these tools? I want to stop both of us now, because you and I would spend the rest of the day chatting up this stuff, but I want to give a chance to some people in the room to ask questions. So as we start to think about this, and I blatantly, horribly stole this whole concept from somebody in San Diego just a couple of days ago. So I will acknowledge that instead of plagiarizing it. So what I was thinking about is we start to think about things changing over time. So, I remember years ago, my parents telling me, don't meet strangers online and don't get into cars with people I don't know, right? Those are two of the mantras that people, my parents were always telling me. And yet here we are a few years later basically paying strangers to get into their car and have them just drive us wherever they want to. Hopefully where we want them to, but basically. So things have changed. So the stuff that we're talking about now is not going to change overnight. But over the next several years, over the next couple of decades, we're going to start to see things that we thought were just inconceivable start to become very real and conceivable. So we've got a few minutes for questions, and I will repeat whatever question is asked so that you can hear it clearly, JJ.
Great.
Yeah, so I have a question, Joe. You're talking about replication and confidence in research by SSRN in terms of research outputs and objects beyond the actual article. Do you have any plans for that, or include those into the actual?
Sure. So we looked at, as we've been having this set of conversations, we started to look at data, and as you know, my friends Javin West and Carl Bergstrom tell me I can't say data without saying and code. So data and code. And so we started looking at that. So in the SSRN library, we have this kind of crude sense of some of those objects starting to be surfaced. So we've always had video and audio and PowerPoints and things like that. But we started to really focus on data and code. We did a project with the Sloan Foundation to talk about replication and sharing in the social sciences. And we basically said we really needed to have this come in. So what I like to say is that we basically want to say, do you want fries with that? So you submit a paper to SSRN and we say, do you want fries with that? Do you have data with that? And then can it be publicly shared or should it be privately held until you actually then go to submit to something else? We started to build those systems, and right now we're actually in the midst of integrating with Mendeley's reference data management system. So it was too complex for us to manage it on our own. So we're right now bringing in Mendeley's reference data management system into SSRN as we speak. I just saw some of the alpha code the other day. So that will allow people to share this code simply and easily. Or if not, when the journal asks for it 2-3 years down the line, we actually have it and we can then hand it off to them.
I have a question whether you are thinking about introducing citing relations within SSRN. I don't recall having seen one. I know you can download data. This is a different matter, and probably would enhance the kind of interdisciplinarity that you're talking about. The other second point I'll just make is that you kind of anticipated my question about citation management software by mentioning Mendeley. I would hope that you would also include products from other companies, including, for example, RefWorks, which a lot of us use. We're not all focused on citation management software. There is an extension, the .RIS extension, which gives interoperability between citation management software, but it can only help everyone.
Sure. I'll take the questions in reverse order because the second one's very simple and the first one actually is a little bit more complex. But we actually have had for about 8 years a drop down on the bottom of the SSRN abstract page where you could click down to a button where it said suggested citation. There was a drop down there for 8 years where you could actually export to EndNote, to RefWorks, to BibTeX, to a couple of other tools. The problem was that it became overly complex for us. And again, I'm dialing back about 7 or 8 years for the prior 8 years. Version control was not necessarily version control in all of these software packages. So when they started to change the mapping between the different tools, it became a nightmare for us to be able to be aware of it and then to say, am I using EndNote 3.0, EndNote 4.0, EndNote 5? So the list got too complex for us. So we're actually looking to bring that back in and be able to export in the standard that you're talking about. Because now there is a standard that can go out and the different packages can suck it in. So that's also in process. The other question is a really interesting one. So when you talk about citations, we actually do have citations. So if you look at the SSRN page, you'll see downloads, you'll see citations. We actually are right now starting to integrate Plum, the Plum print. So Plum is another tool that also shows a whole bunch of media mentions and all kinds of other things. That one's being added. We've had citations for about 15 years. Now, it's citations within the SSRN library. So we look at the corpus, our development from ITX, broke apart the PDF into the component parts. We look at what references what, and then we show that linking. Now, for us, citations is not a vanity metric. I think this gets to the heart of what you're talking about. Downloads are great, but we do validation on downloads because we want the right number. We want to be able to compare across different pieces of paper or research papers downloaded. Citations are the same thing. In the SSRN library, you go to an abstract page, you see the number of downloads, you see the citations, you see the references as a tab, and you see citations as a tab. And again, the idea is not to have a big vanity metric. The idea is to help the researcher create innovative research faster. So what we mean by that is, I look at a paper, I can see what papers it was influenced by, and what papers it influenced. Because as any of the researchers know, as anybody who writes research knows, it's not necessarily that one paper. I may want to see the paper 2 or 3 influences prior back, or I may want to see what came out of it afterwards. So for us, citations are to help us flow through the literature, not just to show another vanity metric with more numbers. So it actually is there for maybe a different reason than some of the people think.
How many papers are actually cited? I use SSRN, I just have those, maybe I can write papers.
Traditionally, traditionally the problem we had was law papers, because law papers use footnotes and not a bibliography or reference section. We actually have some black magic going on that I couldn't explain to you if I had to, basically where they suck the reference out of a footnote, so you actually can see that happening across footnotes. But every single paper that comes into SSRN is then filled through that. I know that they're right now working and doing the updating for footnotes, so they may be a little bit behind, but if you look on most papers, you should see little tabs at the top and see the references, and you can see the list and the link to any papers we have, and you'll see the citations and link to any papers that are within the SSRN library. I know we're a little bit over time, but is there any one last burning question? Okay, then I would most appreciate you giving a warm, heartfelt, rousing round of applause for JJ for joining us from Michigan.
Thank you.
And thanks
Happy
everybody.
to be here.
We're here if you have any questions. Thank you very much.